The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under a moonless sky. No stars, no horizon, only the sound of water breaking against steel hulls as a Japanese cruiser column moved through the darkness with the confidence of predators who owned the night. They had trained for this. Years of drills, optical rangefinders calibrated to perfection, lookouts whose eyes could distinguish a ship's silhouette at distances that seemed impossible. The Americans feared Japanese night combat capability, and with good reason. In every previous war, in every previous century, darkness had been an equalizer, a veil that hid movement, confused targeting, turned naval combat into close-range chaos where training and nerve decided outcomes. But on this night, something had changed. 18 miles away, young American sailors sat in darkened compartments, staring at glowing screens. Green phosphorescent blips appeared on circular displays, each representing a ship the Japanese thought invisible. The Americans knew exactly where they were, how fast they moved, what course they steered. The Japanese lookouts stared into perfect darkness. The Americans stared at perfect information. When the first salvo arrived, it came from a direction the Japanese never saw. The shells fell with devastating accuracy onto ships that hadn't yet identified a target. In the confusion, Japanese commanders called for visual confirmation that never came. Their fleet was being methodically destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see, using a technology they didn't fully understand was being used against them. This wasn't how night combat was supposed to work. The doctrines that governed naval warfare in the 1930s were shaped by lessons written in smoke and blood during the First World War. Every major navy studied Jutland, Tsushima, and the commerce warfare campaigns that had strangled empires. But each drew different conclusions about what future war would demand. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the lesson was clarity itself. In any war with the United States, Japan would face an enemy with superior industrial capacity, more ships, and greater resources. Victory could only come through qualitative superiority, better training, better tactics, and the willingness to fight under conditions where American advantages diminished. Night combat became the cornerstone of this philosophy. Japanese naval officers trained obsessively for darkness operations. Their lookouts underwent selection processes that bordered on the extreme, with only those possessing exceptional night vision making the cut. Optical rangefinders were manufactured to tolerances that pushed the limits of 1930s precision engineering. Binoculars were individually calibrated. Training exercises occurred in absolute darkness again and again until crews could coordinate complex maneuvers without lights, without radio chatter, relying on pre-arranged signals and internalized timing. The results were undeniable. By the late 1930s, Japanese destroyers and cruisers could execute night torpedo attacks with a precision that stunned foreign observers. Their long-lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled weapons with extraordinary range and speed, could be launched from distances that kept the launching ship outside visual range of its target. When combined with superior night optics and crew training, this created a tactical system that seemed nearly invincible after dark. Western navies noted this capability with concern, but also with a degree of skepticism. Night combat was considered inherently chaotic, difficult to control, prone to friendly fire incidents and confusion. The British Royal Navy, with its long traditions, preferred engagements in daylight, where superior gunnery and fleet coordination could be properly employed. The U.S. Navy held similar views, though some forward-thinking officers recognized that any Pacific war would inevitably involve night actions. What few anticipated was that technology might shift the entire calculus. Radar, the ability to use radio waves to detect distant objects, existed as a concept in multiple countries by the mid-1930s. British scientists developed it urgently as war with Germany loomed. American researchers pursued parallel efforts. The Japanese knew radar existed. Their own researchers had explored the principle. But the applications diverged dramatically based on each navy's strategic assumptions. Japan's approach was initially cautious for different reasons. Early radar sets were unreliable, prone to malfunction, difficult to interpret. The cathode ray tubes that displayed returns were dim and required operators to sit in darkness to see them properly. The effective range was limited. Senior officers, trained in visual gunnery and skeptical of newfangled electronics, questioned whether radar would prove useful in the confusion of actual combat. But institutional momentum, particularly in the Navy's Bureau of Ships and among younger technical officers, pushed radar development forward. The CAXM air search radar went to sea in 1940. The SC set followed. Then came the SG surface search radar, a compact system that could fit on destroyers and could detect surface ships at ranges beyond visual capability, even in daylight, and far beyond it at night. By late 1941, dozens of U.S. Navy ships carried radar. Most captains still regarded it as supplementary to visual sighting. Doctrine hadn't caught up to capability. The equipment was there, functioning, providing information, but the tactical revolution it represented remained incompletely understood by the officers who would soon need it desperately. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered American complacency and forced immediate, brutal learning. In the months that followed, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with the speed that seemed unstoppable, U.S. Navy commanders faced a fundamental problem. They had to fight, and fight soon, despite being outnumbered, outpositioned, and facing an enemy with superior night combat doctrine. The early engagements were disasters. In the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, a Japanese cruiser force executed a textbook night attack against Allied ships guarding the Guadalcanal landings. Japanese lookouts spotted the American and Australian ships first. Japanese torpedoes struck before effective return fire could be coordinated. 4 Allied cruisers went to the bottom. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. Navy history, and it happened in darkness, exactly as Japanese doctrine predicted. But something was beginning to shift, slowly, beneath the surface of these tactical defeats. Some American ships at Savo Island had radar. The destroyer USS Blue detected the Japanese force, but misidentified the contact. The cruiser USS Chicago's radar showed returns, but the information wasn't properly integrated into the ship's response. This wasn't a failure of technology. The radar worked exactly as designed. It was a failure of doctrine, of understanding, of the human and institutional systems needed to turn electronic data into decisive action. After Savo Island, American commanders began asking harder questions. Why did we have warning and not use it? How do we train radar operators not just to see contacts, but to understand them? How do we integrate radar information into fire control systems so that guns can engage targets the human eye cannot see? The answers came through painful trial and error, through the work of junior officers and enlisted radar operators who began developing their own unofficial procedures, through combat information centers that evolved from improvised arrangements into systematized nerve centers where radar data, radio reports, and human judgment combined into tactical awareness. Japanese intelligence officers knew the Americans had radar. Reports mentioned it. Captured equipment was examined, but the strategic implications remained underestimated, partly because Japan's early successes seemed to validate existing doctrine, partly because radar's true impact only became clear when integrated into a complete tactical system, something that takes time, training, and repeated combat experience to develop. By late 1942, that system was beginning to crystallize in the U.S. Navy. Radar operators were no longer just technicians monitoring equipment. They were becoming combat specialists whose observations could determine the outcome of engagements. Combat information centers were being standardized, with dedicated spaces shielded from light, where officers could study radar displays without ruining their night vision. Fire control systems were being modified to accept radar data as targeting input. Most importantly, commanders were beginning to trust what the radar told them, even when it contradicted visual observation or when there was no visual observation at all. The darkness of the Pacific night, which had been Japan's ally, was becoming contested territory. The electromagnetic spectrum, invisible to human senses, was turning into a battlefield where American technology was establishing dominance that Japanese optical superiority couldn't counter. By the time Japanese naval commanders fully grasped what was happening, the battles that would prove it were already approaching. Guadalcanal, a miserable jungle island barely known to the world, was about to become the arena where darkness itself would change allegiance. The men who operated the radar sets were mostly young. Many had been civilians months earlier. Radio technicians, electronics hobbyists, college students with a knack for mathematics. The Navy's rapid expansion pulled them in and pushed them through abbreviated training programs that taught them to read the phosphorescent glow of cathode ray displays, to distinguish real contacts from sea return and weather clutter, to estimate ranges and bearings with equipment that was still evolving. They worked in darkened compartments, often cramped spaces deep in the ship where the noise of ventilation fans mixed with the hum of electronics. While lookouts stood exposed on deck, scanning horizons with binoculars, radar operators sat before circular screens where glowing sweeps painted targets as anonymous blips. There was something deeply strange about this, knowing that ships were out there, calculating their positions with increasing accuracy while having no visual confirmation whatsoever. It required a new kind of trust. Trust in the equipment, which could and did malfunction. Trust in their own interpretation when a contact might be a ship, or might be a rain squall, or might be an artifact of wave interference. Trust that the officers receiving their reports would act on them, would risk their ships based on information that contradicted the evidence of human eyes. In those early battles, that trust was fragile. Radar operators reported contacts only to have bridge officers dismiss them, insisting on visual confirmation before taking action. The institutional reflex was powerful. Naval officers had been trained for decades to trust their eyes, to verify, to confirm. A glowing dot on a screen seemed insubstantial compared to the solid reality of a ship's silhouette against the horizon. But the radar operators kept reporting, kept refining their craft, began to recognize patterns, the way a formation of ships appeared on the display versus a single vessel, the characteristic signature of a cruiser versus a destroyer, the speed calculations that could predict an enemy's course even before visual contact seemed possible. Meanwhile, on Japanese ships, lookouts performed their duties with the confidence of specialists at the peak of their profession. Their training was extraordinary by any measure. Selection had been rigorous. Their eyes had adapted to darkness through careful preparation before each night action, avoiding bright lights for hours beforehand, sometimes using red-filtered illumination to preserve night vision while reading charts or instruments.
They used binoculars that represented the finest optical manufacturing Japan could produce. They knew how to scan systematically, how to detect motion against dark water, how to distinguish the subtle difference between a wave and a bow wake. On quiet nights, experienced lookouts could hear enemy ships before seeing them, the sound of turbines carrying across calm water. Their reports were trusted absolutely. When a lookout called out a contact, the entire ship responded. Guns trained toward the bearing, torpedo tubes swung into position. The fire control system, mechanical computers of extraordinary precision, calculated firing solutions based on visual ranges and bearings. This system had worked flawlessly in previous engagements. At Savo Island, Japanese lookouts spotted American ships first, and that advantage cascaded into complete tactical dominance. There was no reason to think it wouldn't continue working, except that the fundamental assumption underlying the entire system, that both sides operated under the same information constraints, was silently becoming obsolete. The tactical asymmetry forming in late 1942 was profound but invisible to Japanese commanders. They knew American ships had radar, intelligence reports said so, but knowing a technology exists is different from understanding its implications. Japanese doctrine assumed that radar might help with early warning, might provide some advance notice of enemy ships. What it didn't anticipate was radar enabling accurate gunfire at ranges and in conditions where Japanese optical superiority became completely irrelevant. The American approach to night combat was evolving rapidly, shaped by necessity and enabled by technology. Instead of trying to match Japanese expertise in visual detection, U.S. commanders were developing tactics that bypassed the contest entirely. Let the Japanese have superior optics, let them have better trained lookouts. If American radar could detect them first, if fire control systems could generate targeting solutions from radar data, if guns could deliver accurate fire based on electronic information, then the entire game changed.
It was a revolution happening in increments, in individual engagements where new procedures were tested, refined, sometimes failed, gradually succeeded. Each battle taught lessons. Each radar operator became more skilled. Each commanding officer learned to trust the green glowing dots a little more. By October 1942, the U.S. Navy was ready to test whether this new approach could actually defeat Japanese night fighting doctrine in direct combat. The test would come in the waters off Guadalcanal, in battles fought in absolute darkness, where two completely different tactical philosophies would collide. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood industrial mathematics with painful clarity. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, toured American factories and oil fields. He knew Japan couldn't win a prolonged war against the United States. His strategy for the Pacific War rested on a calculation: inflict enough damage early, secure enough territory, make the cost of American victory so high that negotiated peace became preferable to years of grinding combat. Within that strategy, the Imperial Japanese naval qualitative superiority was essential. Superior training, superior tactics, superior performance in exactly those conditions: night combat, long-range torpedo attacks, aggressive surface engagements, where American industrial advantages wouldn't immediately translate into battlefield dominance. Yamamoto believed in this superiority because it was real. Japanese naval performance in 1942 validated the doctrine repeatedly, but there was an assumption embedded in this belief: that the fundamentals of naval combat would remain constant, that the contest would continue to be fought on terms where Japanese advantages mattered. The possibility that technology might shift those fundamentals seems to have been underestimated, not from ignorance, but from a form of strategic inertia. Japan's own radar development was proceeding, but slowly, with limited resources allocated to it. The Naval General Staff considered other priorities more pressing: building ships, training crews, securing fuel supplies, maintaining the expanding defensive perimeter. There was also a cultural dimension that historians have debated. Japanese naval culture prized fighting spirit, aggressive tactics, the warrior ethos exemplified by the samurai tradition. Technology was important, but not as important as human factors: training, courage, determination. This wasn't superstition, it was a coherent philosophy rooted in Japan's historical experience and recent successes. But it created a blind spot regarding technologies that might make human factors less decisive. On the American side, adaptation was happening at multiple levels simultaneously. Individual ship commanders were experimenting with radar-directed tactics. Squadron commanders were developing formation doctrines that maximized radar coverage. At higher levels, the Navy's leadership was pushing for more radar sets, better training, faster integration of electronic warfare into standard operating procedure.
There was resistance, particularly among older officers who had built their careers on visual gunnery and traditional fleet tactics, but combat losses have a way of forcing institutional change. After Savo Island, after other costly engagements, the arguments for fully embracing radar warfare became harder to dismiss. Admiral Willis Lee, commanding a battleship force, became one of radar's most effective advocates. He personally spent hours in combat information centers, learning how radar operators worked, understanding what the equipment could and couldn't do. He developed tactics specifically designed to exploit radar's advantages, approaching at night, maintaining radar silence until the moment of engagement, then using radar-directed fire to achieve surprise. The contrast between Japanese and American approaches was stark by late 1942. Japan was refining and perfecting existing doctrine. America was inventing new doctrine in real time, driven by technological capability and desperate necessity. There was also a moral dimension that some American officers found troubling, though it was rarely discussed openly at the time. Radar-directed fire meant killing men who never saw their killers, destroying ships whose crews had no chance to fight back effectively. It violated certain assumptions about combat as a contest between equals, about the warrior ethic that still lingered in naval culture, despite industrialized warfare's earlier lessons. But war prioritizes effectiveness over ethics, survival over honor. The officers who expressed such concerns generally kept them private. The institutional pressure was entirely toward exploiting every advantage, and radar was an enormous advantage. From the Japanese perspective, there was growing unease even before the full implications became clear. Reports from Guadalcanal mentioned strange patterns: American ships maneuvering with confidence in total darkness, gunfire arriving with unsettling accuracy before visual contact. Some officers speculated about advanced radar, others attributed it to luck or to captured intelligence about Japanese movements. The truth was more fundamental. The Americans were fighting a different kind of naval war, one where information dominance through electronics mattered more than optical superiority or traditional gunnery excellence, and they were getting better at it with each engagement. By the time of the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, the contrast between doctrines was about to produce decisive results. Japanese forces approached with their usual confidence in night operations. American forces waited, with radar providing complete awareness of enemy positions, movements, and intentions. The darkness that had protected Japanese naval power was about to become the medium of its defeat.
The night of November 12-13, 1942, was moonless and overcast. Perfect conditions for Japanese night operations. two forces converged on the waters north of Guadalcanal, a Japanese bombardment group intending to shell the airfield's assets and an American force positioned to intercept them. Aboard the American ships, radar operators tracked the Japanese approach with increasing precision. The contacts appeared on screens as distinct blips, their courses and speeds calculated, their formation identified. In the combat information centers, officers watched the enemy fleet approaching while their own lookouts saw nothing but darkness. Admiral Daniel Callahan commanded the American force from USS San Francisco, a heavy cruiser. His force included 4 destroyers in the van, then the cruisers in line, then more destroyers trailing. The Japanese force under Admiral Hiroaki Abe included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, plus escorts, a powerful formation confident in its ability to sweep aside opposition. The two forces closed rapidly, both steaming at absolute tactical darkness. The Americans knew exactly where the Japanese were. The Japanese knew American ships were in the area, but lacked precise positioning. At approximately 0124 hours, the range had closed to under 10,000 yards, close by any standard, suicidally close for a night engagement by traditional doctrine. American destroyers in the van were tracking Japanese ships on radar while still unable to see them visually. The tension in the combat information centers was extraordinary, watching contacts approach, waiting for orders, knowing that seconds would determine whether they achieved surprise or died under Japanese guns. Then the Japanese lookouts spotted American ships. Searchlights blazed. The disciplined darkness exploded into chaos. What followed was one of the most confused and brutal naval engagements in history. Ships fired at point-blank range, torpedoes crossed between formations, friendly fire incidents occurred on both sides as the orderly battle plans disintegrated into a melee where identification was nearly impossible. But within that chaos, radar provided American ships with a crucial advantage. They had known the Japanese were coming, had positioned themselves advantageously, and in the initial moments of contact, several American ships had achieved hits before Japanese fire became effective.
USS Washington, a battleship under Admiral Lee's command that arrived later, demonstrated radar's potential even more clearly. While other ships were engaged in close-range chaos, Washington hung back, using her SG radar to track the Japanese battleship Kirishima at ranges where visual identification was impossible. Her fire control system accepted radar data directly. When Washington opened fire, her 16-inch guns were already precisely aimed. Kirishima never saw what hit her. The first salvo struck with devastating accuracy. Subsequent salvos followed with mechanical precision, each guided by radar tracking that the Japanese had no equivalent for. Kirishima was crippled within minutes, her superstructure wrecked, fires spreading, steering damaged. She would sink before dawn. The Americans lost ships too, destroyers and cruisers damaged or sunk in the close-range fighting. Admiral Callahan was killed on San Francisco's bridge. By traditional measures, it was a costly engagement, but strategically the Americans had achieved their objective, stopping the Japanese bombardment and demonstrating that night combat was no longer one-sided. Japanese after-action reports noted the unusual accuracy of American fire, the way some ships seemed to maneuver with awareness before visual contact, the disturbing impression of being watched in darkness. Some officers suspected radar was involved, but the full implications remained unclear. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning rapidly. Officers analyzed the engagement obsessively. What worked? What failed? How could radar be used more effectively? How could formations be arranged to maximize radar coverage and minimize friendly fire risk? Admiral Lee, in particular, drew clear conclusions. Radar had worked. It had provided the information needed to achieve surprise and deliver effective fire. The challenge now was refining tactics to exploit this advantage systematically rather than in the confused circumstances of a night melee. 2 months later, the U.S. Navy would have another opportunity to test radar warfare, this time in circumstances that would prove even more decisive. October 25, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines. Nearly 2 years had passed since Guadalcanal, and in that time, both the technology and doctrine of radar warfare had evolved dramatically. The strategic situation was desperate for Japan. American forces had returned to the Philippines. The Imperial Navy, its strength diminished by years of attrition, launched a complex, multi-pronged operation, the last major offensive effort it could muster. One element of this operation involved a force under Admiral Shoji Nishimura steaming through Surigao Strait to attack American landing forces from the south. It was a classic night approach through restricted waters, exactly the kind of operation Japanese doctrine had prepared for. Nishimura commanded battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, plus cruisers and destroyers. His force would enter the strait in darkness, transit northward, and engage the Americans in the confusion of night combat, where Japanese training should provide an edge. What Nishimura didn't know, couldn't have known with his available intelligence, was that Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had positioned a force across the northern exit of the strait in a formation specifically designed to exploit radar's advantages. Old American battleships, survivors of Pearl Harbor, had been positioned in a line across Nishimura's route of advance. Cruisers were arranged to provide overlapping radar coverage. Destroyers were stationed for torpedo attacks, guided by radar tracking. Oldendorf's force wasn't guessing where the Japanese would be. They were watching them come. As Nishimura's ships entered the strait, American radar operators tracked their progress with calm precision. The contacts appeared clearly on displays, their movements predictable within the confined waters. In combat information centers, officers plotted the Japanese course and calculated the optimal moment to engage. The Japanese fleet advanced in confident darkness. Their lookouts scanned ahead. Their formation was disciplined. They had no indication that they were being observed with complete clarity, that their position was known to within yards, that every ship in the American force was already aimed at them. American destroyers attacked first, launching torpedoes based on radar targeting. The torpedoes ran true through the darkness, guided to targets their crews never saw visually. Battleship Fuso was hit and began to fall behind, crippled and burning. Nishimura's remaining ships pressed forward. They had come too far to retreat. The mission required them to reach the landing areas. They continued northward through the strait, into progressively tighter waters, toward the American line they knew must exist, but couldn't yet see. Then, at 0353 hours, the American battleships opened fire. 6 battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, Pennsylvania, delivered salvo after salvo with a precision that night combat had never previously allowed. Their fire control systems were fed directly from radar. Their guns tracked targets they would never see with human eyes. The shell splashes that marked misses couldn't be observed, but corrections weren't needed. The radar provided perfect tracking. Yamashiro, Nishimura's flagship, was hit repeatedly. 14 and 16-inch shells tore through her superstructure. Fires spread. Her speed dropped. Still, she continued forward, firing back at muzzle flashes, trying to close range where Japanese optical fire control might matter. It never mattered. The range never closed enough. Yamashiro absorbed devastating punishment from enemies she couldn't effectively target. Within 30 minutes, she capsized and sank. Admiral Nishimura went down with his ship.
The other Japanese ships fared no better. Cruisers were destroyed by concentrated cruiser fire, again directed by radar. Destroyers attempted to escape, but were tracked and engaged. By dawn, Nishimura's force had been virtually annihilated.
The Battle of Surigao Strait was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. It was also a perfect demonstration of radar warfare. The Americans had executed what naval theorists call crossing the T, positioning their line of battle perpendicular to the enemy's line of advance, allowing all their guns to bear while the enemy could only use forward turrets. But they'd done it in total darkness, using electronic eyes, with a precision that previous generations of naval officers would have considered impossible. Japanese survivors reported that they felt helpless, that they were being destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see or effectively fight back against. That sense of helplessness was precisely accurate. The tactical superiority Japan had built through training and doctrine had been rendered obsolete by a technology that changed the fundamental rules of engagement. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Surigao Strait marked the end of an era. Night combat would never again be a Japanese advantage. The darkness they had mastered no longer protected them. The Americans could see in the dark, and what they could see, they could destroy. The immediate tactical reports flowing back to Japanese naval headquarters were devastating in their clarity. Entire formations destroyed, battleships lost, commanders killed. But embedded in those reports were details that disturbed senior officers even more than the losses themselves. The descriptions of American fire arriving with impossible accuracy, of being hit before visual contact, of the systematic way American ships maneuvered as if they possessed perfect information. After Guadalcanal, some officers had suspected advanced radar. After Surigao Strait, suspicion became certainty. The Americans possessed fire control radar that functioned effectively in combat conditions, that could be integrated into gunnery systems, that provided targeting capability in absolute darkness. Japan had no equivalent, and at this stage of the war lacked the resources to develop one quickly enough to matter. The psychological impact within the Imperial Navy was profound. An institution built on the assumption of tactical superiority in night combat suddenly confronted its obsolescence. Officers who had spent careers perfecting visual fire control, training lookouts, developing night fighting doctrine, now understood that all that expertise could be bypassed by technology they didn't possess. There were attempts to adapt. Japanese ships began trying to avoid night engagements when possible, a reversal of previous doctrine. Formations changed to maximize dispersion, reducing the damage from radar-directed gunfire. Some cruisers received upgraded radar sets, though these were primarily air search systems rather than the surface search and fire control radars that had given Americans such decisive advantage. American confidence, meanwhile, hardened into doctrine. Radar warfare transitioned from experimental to standard. New construction included advanced radar systems as baseline equipment. Training pipelines expanded to produce more radar operators. Combat information centers became larger, more sophisticated, more central to how ships fought. The U.S. Navy published revised tactical doctrines that assumed radar availability and capability. Night combat was no longer something to avoid or endure. It was an opportunity to exploit technological advantage. Formations were designed around radar coverage patterns. Communications procedures were developed to rapidly share radar information between ships.
Individual officers who had pioneered radar tactics were promoted, their methods studied and disseminated. Admiral Lee's approach at Guadalcanal became standard curriculum at naval warfare schools. The institutional resistance from traditionally minded officers evaporated in the face of clear combat results. There was also recognition that radar represented just one element of a broader technological shift. The same electromagnetic spectrum that radar exploited could be used for other purposes: electronic warfare, communications intelligence, countermeasures. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a conflict where electromagnetic dominance mattered as much as gunnery excellence or torpedo skill. For the destroyer and cruiser captains who had survived night battles, the emotional response was complex. Relief at having technology that improved survival odds, professional satisfaction at mastering new systems, but also, for some, a sense of loss, the feeling that naval combat was becoming less about seamanship and human skill and more about who possessed superior electronics. That last feeling was probably inevitable. Every major technological shift in warfare produces similar responses from professionals trained in earlier methods, but it didn't change the strategic reality. Radar had fundamentally altered naval combat, and there was no going back. The Battle of Surigao Strait marked a clear before and after moment, not just for the Pacific War, but for naval warfare globally. Navies around the world studied the engagement with intense interest. The lesson was unambiguous. In modern naval combat, information superiority through electronics mattered more than traditional factors like gunnery training or superior optics. Britain's Royal Navy, which had pioneered radar earlier in the war for air defense, accelerated its own integration of radar into surface warfare doctrine. Soviet observers took careful note, beginning radar development programs that would shape Cold War naval technology. Even smaller navies recognized that future effectiveness would depend on mastering electromagnetic systems. The age of optical naval warfare, the age that had stretched from the age of sail through Jutland and into World War II, was definitively over. Battles would still be fought with guns and torpedoes, but the targeting, the situational awareness, the fundamental information that determined tactical success now came from electronics rather than human senses. This shift had implications beyond pure tactics. The design of warships changed. Electrical generating capacity increased to power sophisticated electronic systems. Combat information centers expanded, requiring more space and personnel. New specialist ratings emerged: electronic technicians, electronic warfare operators, systems analysts. The human dimension of naval service evolved as well. A 19th-century sailor would have recognized much about naval life in 1941: the watches, the seamanship, the visual signaling, the reliance on human senses. By 1945, that same sailor would have found himself in a world where invisible electromagnetic waves carried more tactical significance than anything visible to the eye. For Japan, the strategic consequences were irreversible. Even had the war continued longer, even had resources existed for industrial recovery, the technological gap in electronics had become too wide to bridge. American radar technology continued advancing throughout 1944 and 1945. New systems provided longer range, better resolution, improved integration with weapons. The brief period when Japan's night fighting doctrine could contest American naval power in the Pacific had closed completely. There was also a larger lesson about technological warfare that Surigao Strait illustrated perfectly. Innovations don't just provide incremental advantages, they can make entire doctrines obsolete. Japan had invested enormous effort into night combat training. That training was genuinely effective. Japanese lookouts and gunnery crews were superb by any objective measure. But technology had changed the game to one where those skills no longer mattered decisively.
This pattern of revolutionary technology rendering expertise obsolete would repeat throughout military history. Later, precision-guided munitions would make traditional bombing skills less critical. Stealth technology would devalue sophisticated radar systems. Each generation of military technology produces a cohort of experts whose skills become suddenly less relevant when the underlying system changes.
The psychological dimension of this shouldn't be underestimated. For Japanese naval officers who had built careers on mastering night combat, who had trained endlessly for darkness operations, who had taken pride in capabilities that seemed to represent the warrior spirit. For them, the realization that technology had made their expertise irrelevant must have been deeply bitter. But war doesn't pause for such considerations. By late 1944, the Pacific War had moved beyond the point where any Japanese tactical innovation could change strategic outcomes. American industrial and technological superiority was overwhelming. Radar warfare was just one element of that superiority, though it was a particularly clear example. The permanent legacy of radar and naval warfare extended far beyond 1945. Every modern warship carries sophisticated radar systems. Naval tactics assume electromagnetic awareness. Combat information centers are the nerve centers of modern vessels. The revolution that began with crude cathode ray displays and young operators learning their craft in darkness became the foundation of contemporary naval operations. And it all traced back to those nights in the Pacific when darkness changed allegiance, when Japanese admirals discovered that confidence in traditional superiority couldn't overcome technological reality, when American ships found their targets in total darkness and proved that war's oldest arena, the sea at night, had been fundamentally transformed. The ocean at night hasn't changed. The same darkness still falls. The same absence of visual reference still exists when clouds cover the moon and stars. From a physical standpoint, the conditions that made night combat so difficult and so chaotic for centuries remain identical. What changed was human capability within that darkness. Before radar, night combat was fundamentally a contest of human senses operating at their limits. Training could improve those senses, doctrine could optimize how they were employed, but the fundamental constraint remained biological. Human eyes can only see so far. Human ears can only hear so much. No amount of discipline or courage could overcome those physical limits. Radar removed the constraint. Not immediately, not perfectly, but decisively. It provided information that human senses couldn't access, at ranges human capabilities couldn't match, with a reliability that optical observation in darkness could never achieve. And that information, once integrated into tactical systems, became the foundation of a new kind of warfare. There was no spectacle to this revolution. Radar operators sat in darkened compartments staring at glowing screens. The electromagnetic waves that made detection possible were invisible. The transformation happened quietly, in increments, through technical refinements and doctrinal adaptations that lacked any dramatic single moment of change. Yet the consequences were absolute. An entire approach to naval warfare, one that Japan had perfected through years of training and doctrinal development, became obsolete. Not ineffective, not inferior, obsolete. The contest had moved to a domain where traditional advantages didn't apply. This is how technological warfare operates. The advantage goes not necessarily to the more courageous, or the better trained, or the more tactically sophisticated, but to whoever possesses superior information and can act on it effectively. Radar provided that information. American doctrine learned to act on it. Japanese forces, regardless of their skill or determination, couldn't compete in a contest where they fundamentally lacked the tools needed for parity.
The darkness that had protected Japanese naval power, that had been their ally through training and doctrine, became neutral and then hostile. Not because the darkness itself changed, but because one side could see through it and the other couldn't. There's something cold about this. Technology as a silent arbiter of tactical outcomes, removing the human element that earlier warfare emphasized. But war has always moved toward whatever provides advantage, and information has always been among the most decisive advantages. Radar provided that information. American doctrine learned to act on it. Japanese forces, regardless of their skill or determination, couldn't compete in a contest where they fundamentally lacked the tools needed for parity. The darkness that had protected Japanese naval power, that had been their ally through training and doctrine, became neutral and then hostile. Not because the darkness itself changed, but because one side could see through it and the other couldn't. There's something cold about this. Technology as a silent arbiter of tactical outcomes, removing the human element that earlier warfare emphasized. But war has always moved toward whatever provides advantage, and information has always been among the most decisive advantages. Radar simply made information dominance achievable in conditions where it had previously been impossible. The admirals who commanded Japanese forces at Guadalcanal and Surigao Strait weren't incompetent. Their tactics weren't flawed by the standards of their training. They approached night combat with justified confidence based on proven capability. What they didn't anticipate, what perhaps they couldn't have anticipated, given their institutional perspective, was that the fundamental rules were changing, that darkness was no longer the protective element they assumed it to be. By the time they understood, it was too late. The technological gap couldn't be closed. The tactical advantage couldn't be reclaimed. The war moved forward with radar as a permanent feature of naval combat, a feature that would only grow more sophisticated, more capable, more central to how ships fought. War changed that night, not through spectacle, but through silent observation, through young men watching glowing dots on screens, through technology making the invisible visible, through information flowing into tactical systems that transformed awareness into decisive action. The darkness remained. What changed was who controlled it.